She didn't raise her voice. She just looked at me like I was already gone. "Nobody needs you anymore." She said it calmly, almost casually. I was standing in the middle of an empty room, holding papers I didn't remember signing. And that was when I realized something in my life had ended long before I noticed it. My name is Arthur Penhaligon. I am 73 years old, and I spent 40 years of my life building a home in Phoenix, Arizona. It was a modest ranch house on a quiet street, the kind of place where the heat of the desert felt manageable as long as you were inside with the people you loved. But that afternoon, the air conditioning was humming like a funeral dirge, and the woman I had been married to for 47 years was telling me that I was a ghost. Brenda and I had met in a library in Tucson when we were barely 20. She was sharp, organized, and always knew where the pens were. I liked that about her. I was the dreamer, the one who worked with his hands in construction, while she handled the ledgers of our lives. For decades, it worked. Or I told myself it did. I handed her my paychecks, and she handed me a life that felt secure. But the house didn't feel secure anymore. I looked down at the documents in my hand. They were from a law firm downtown, something about a quiet title and a transfer of assets I had supposedly agreed to during my recovery from hip surgery the previous winter. I remembered being tired. I remembered being on heavy medication. I remembered Brenda leaning over the bed with a clipboard, telling me she was simplifying the estate, so our daughter Claire wouldn't have to deal with probate later. I trusted her. You don't live with someone for nearly half a century and expect them to be the person who pulls the rug out from under your feet. But as I stood there in the living room, I realized the furniture looked different. The photos of our grandkids were gone from the mantel. The house felt staged, like a model home waiting for a new family. "Where are my things, Brenda?" I asked. My voice sounded thin, like old parchment. "In the garage, Arthur," she replied, checking her watch. "The appraiser will be here at 4. You really should go before it gets awkward." She wasn't angry. That was the part that chilled me to the bone. She was just finished. To her, I was a line item that had finally been settled. I walked to the window and looked out at the driveway. My old Ford was there, but it looked small against the vastness of the Arizona sky. I had a key to a house I no longer owned, and a marriage that had turned into a legal transaction while I was sleeping. I walked out to the garage, the dry Phoenix heat hitting me like a physical weight. There, stacked neatly beside the workbench where I'd spent 40 years fixing everything from broken toys to leaky faucets, were 6 cardboard boxes. Everything I owned, everything that defined 73 years of being a man, a father, and a husband, had been reduced to what could fit in the back of my truck. Brenda and I had shared a life for 47 years. For the first 30, we were a team. I worked the sites, coming home with sawdust in my hair and calluses on my hands, and I gave it all to her. I didn't care about the bank accounts or the title to the house. I was an engineer of structures, not of fine print. I built the walls, she chose the colors. That was our deal. But looking back now, I see when the foundation started to crack. It wasn't a sudden earthquake, it was a slow, steady erosion. About 10 years ago, when I retired, the power dynamic shifted. Without a paycheck to hand over, I felt like a guest in my own home. Brenda took over every aspect of our finances, claiming my memory wasn't what it used to be. She'd sigh when I couldn't find a utility bill or get frustrated if I asked how much we had in savings. "It's handled, Arthur," she would say. "Just go sit on the patio." The emotional distance grew in increments. We stopped having conversations and started having schedules. She became preoccupied with Claire's life in Scottsdale, with preserving the legacy, and with the rising property values in our neighborhood. I was just a fixture, like the water heater, useful until it gets old and starts to rattle. Last winter, when I was in the hospital for my hip, she brought the papers. I was hazy from the anesthesia, the room spinning. She told me it was a life estate agreement. She said it would protect me if she passed away first, ensuring the house stayed in the family. I signed where she pointed because she was my wife. You don't audit the person who holds your hand in the recovery room, But as I stood in that garage, I realized I hadn't signed a protection. I had signed a quitclaim. I had handed over my half of the house for $10 and love and affection. I opened one of the boxes. On top was a framed photo of us at the Grand Canyon in 1985. We were smiling, leaning into each other. I looked at the glass and saw my own reflection, a tired old man with nowhere to go. I realized then that while I was building a life, she was building an exit strategy. I put the box in the truck bed. My hands were shaking, not from age, but from the sheer cold realization that the person I had loved most in the world had spent the last year treating me like a bad investment she needed to liquidate. I started the engine, the familiar rumble of the Ford, the only thing that felt real. I had a few $100s in a checking account she hadn't touched yet, and a tank of gas. As I backed out of the driveway, I saw the appraiser's car pull up. Brenda didn't even look out the window to see me leave. I was already a memory. I drove toward the center of Phoenix, the heat rising in waves off the asphalt. My first instinct was to call our daughter Claire. She lived in a gated community in Scottsdale, only 20 minutes away. I had helped her with the down payment on that house 6 years ago, dipping into my own modest 401k because she was my only child and she said she was struggling. I figured she would be as horrified as I was. When she answered, the background noise was full of the sounds of my grandkids splashing in a pool. "Dad, is everything okay? Mom said you were moving out today." The word moving felt like a slap. "Moving? Claire, your mother tricked me into signing over the house. I have nowhere to go. I'm in the truck with 6 boxes. There was a long, heavy silence. I expected her to tell me to come over immediately, to say we would call a lawyer together. Instead, she exhaled slowly. "Dad, don't make this bigger than it is. Mom explained it all. She said the house was too much for you to maintain and that you needed a transitional environment. She's selling it so she can help me with the kids' private school tuition. She's selling our home to pay for tuition?" I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. "Claire, I worked 40 years for that roof. I gave you everything I had." "I know, Dad," she said, her voice turning defensive. "But Mom says you have your Social Security and your own savings. She said you wanted to simplify things. Look, I've got a lot on my plate right now. We can talk about it later, okay? Just find a nice motel for tonight." She hung up before I could tell her that the savings she mentioned were in an account Brenda had secondary access to. I pulled into a gas station and checked my balance at the ATM. It read $62. My heart dropped into my stomach. Brenda hadn't just taken the house. She had drained the joint overflow account we used for emergencies, leaving me with only the small, fun money account I kept for my woodworking supplies. I realized then that this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a coordinated strike. Brenda had spent months, maybe years, convincing Claire that I was becoming a burden, someone who couldn't handle his own life. She had framed my displacement as a family necessity. I sat in the cab of the truck, the air conditioning failing to keep up with the 100-degree afternoon. I looked at the 6 boxes in the back. I had built schools and libraries in this state, structures meant to last for generations. I had paid off my mortgage and lived honestly. Now, I was a 73-year-old man with $62 and a daughter who had been coached to see my homelessness as procedural. The sun began to dip toward the horizon, turning the sky a bruised purple. I couldn't afford a motel in Phoenix on $60. I started the engine and began driving aimlessly, looking for a parking lot where a man in a Ford wouldn't be noticed. For the first time in my life, I understood that the person you protect isn't always the person who will protect you. I parked in the far corner of a 24-hour grocery store lot off Camelback Road. The asphalt was still radiating heat from the day, and the cab of the truck felt like a slow cooker. I tried to sleep, but every time a car drove past, my heart jumped into my throat. I was 73 years old, and I was hiding like a criminal. I kept thinking about the outstanding family loan Mark had used to justify his own debts back in Ohio, and I wondered if Claire felt the same sense of entitlement to my life's work. By the second day, the reality of my situation became a physical ache. I used the restroom in a public park to wash my face, staring at the old man in the mirror. I looked like someone I used to feel sorry for. I tried to call Brenda one last time. I wanted to ask her how she could sleep in our bed knowing I was sleeping on a bench seat. "The locks have been changed, Arthur," she said when she picked up. Her voice was as steady as the hands of the attorney I'd seen in Denver who treated a father like a line item. "If you come to the house, I'll have to call the police. Claire and I agreed this is the only way you'll finally look into senior housing. It's for your own safety." "My safety?" I whispered. "I'm living in a parking lot, Brenda." "Don't be dramatic," she snapped. "You have your Social Security. Use it wisely." She hung up, and the silence that followed was deafening. I realized then that my sons in Columbus hadn't been the only ones capable of using their parents as collateral. Brenda had weaponized my own daughter against me, turning my years of support into a narrative of my own incompetence. They were handling it by removing me from the equation entirely. I spent that afternoon sitting in a public library, not for the books, but for the air conditioning. I watched people go about their lives, families choosing movies, kids laughing. I felt like I was watching the world through a thick pane of glass. I thought about Robert Miller, who ended up in a basement because he trusted his son. I hadn't even been given a basement. As the library prepared to close, a young security guard approached me. He wasn't unkind, but his eyes held that look of soft pity that tells you exactly where you stand in the world. "Sir, we're closing up," he said. "Do you have somewhere to go?" I looked at him, and for the first time in my life, I didn't have a lie ready. "I'm just figuring that out," I said. I walked out into the evening heat, the sky a deep, mocking orange. My $62 were down to 40. I needed a plan before the desert night swallowed me whole. On the third day, the heat became more than an inconvenience. It became a threat. I sat in a booth at a diner on West Indian School Road, nursing a black coffee to justify the seat and the shade. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Claire. She didn't ask where I was sleeping. Instead, she sent a link to a state-funded facility on the outskirts of the city. "Mom says this one has an opening," the message read. "It's only $800 a month. Your Social Security covers it perfectly." I stared at the screen, my hands shaking. The facility was miles away, a place with gray walls and a reputation for being the last stop for people the world had given up on. It was the same kind of solution Robert Miller's family had planned for him when they thought he was a burden. They weren't trying to help me. They were trying to warehouse me so they could move on with their lives without the guilt of seeing me. I realized then that if I didn't act, I would disappear. I wasn't confused, and I wasn't incompetent. I was being exploited by the people I had raised, to be honest. I drove to a small legal aid office near downtown. It wasn't a glass building on the 9th floor like the one David's lawyers used. It was a humble brick office with a slow-moving ceiling fan. An attorney named Sarah Miller met with me. She looked at the papers I'd kept in my glove box, the ones Brenda had me sign in the hospital. She read them twice, her expression hardening just like Harold Bennett's had when he saw the forged signatures in Columbus. "Mr. Penhaligon," she said quietly, "you were under heavy sedation when you signed this transfer. There is no witness signature from a neutral party. This isn't just a family matter. This is financial elder abuse." Hearing her say those words felt like a bridge collapsing. I had spent my life building structures to protect people, and now I was the one who needed a shield. She told me we could file for an emergency injunction to halt the sale of the house, but it would be a long, ugly fight. "They are your family," she warned. "If we push this legally, it will tear everything apart permanently." I thought about the empty driveway. I thought about the 6 boxes in my truck. I thought about Brenda's calm, casual voice, telling me nobody needed me anymore. "They already tore it apart," I told her. "I'm just trying to find a place to stand." As I walked back to my truck, I saw a missed call from Claire. I didn't call back. I was done being the old man they could manage. I was 73 years old, and for the first time in 47 years, I was starting a war. The filing of the injunction hit Brenda and Claire like a physical blow. Within 24 hours, the phone calls started. Not the cold, distant directives I had been receiving, but panicked, angry demands. I sat in my truck in a quiet park in Mesa, watching the sun dip behind the mountains, and listened to a voicemail from Claire. She was crying, but it wasn't the kind of crying that comes from remorse. It was the sound of a plan falling apart. "Dad, how could you do this?" she sobbed into the recording. "The buyers are threatening to sue. We already put a deposit down on the kids' school. You're destroying our future for a house you can't even take care of yourself." I didn't answer. I thought about the words Mark had used in Ohio, telling his father not to make it bigger than it is. It was always a technicality or procedural when they were taking, but extreme the moment I stood up. I was being told I was destroying a family that had already decided I was a burden worth liquidating. 2 days later, Sarah Miller, my attorney, called me into her office. She had a stack of financial records she had subpoenaed from the bank. The story they told was even worse than the one I had imagined. Brenda hadn't just moved the house title. She had been systematically transferring funds from my Social Security deposits into Claire's personal accounts for the last 6 months. They hadn't been waiting for me to become incompetent. They had been creating the conditions to prove it. "They were handling it by using your life as a backup plan," Sarah said, echoing a thought I'd had about those boys in Columbus. That afternoon, I met Brenda at a neutral location, a small coffee shop near the courthouse. She looked older, her face tight with a fury she could no longer hide behind a calm mask. She didn't bring coffee. She brought more papers. "Sign the release, Arthur," she hissed, leaning across the table. "If you don't, I'll tell the court you've been wandering the streets, that you're a danger to yourself. I have the notes." I have the evidence. I looked at her, and for the first time in nearly 50 years, I didn't see my wife. I saw a stranger who had been counting my days like coins in a jar. I remembered how Robert Miller's daughter-in-law had made notes of his every mistake to use as evidence of his incompetence. "I'm not signing anything," I said. My voice was quiet, but it didn't shake. "I raised Claire to be honest, and I loved you for 47 years. You didn't just risk my house, Brenda. You risked my life. If you think I will lie to protect this private family matter, you don't know me at all." She stood up, her chair screeching against the tile. "Then you have no family," she said. "Nobody needs you. You're just a broke old man with a grudge." She walked out, and I sat there in the silence. I had won the first round of the legal battle, but as I looked at my reflection in the dark coffee, I realized the cost. I was 73, I was still sleeping in a truck, and I was officially alone. The legal battle ended not with a dramatic courtroom scene, but in a sterile conference room with the smell of stale air and fluorescent lights. Brenda's attorney realized that the evidence of financial exploitation was too clear to ignore. They agreed to a settlement. The house would be sold, but the proceeds would be split equally, and the funds stolen from my accounts would be repaid from her share. It wasn't a victory that felt like winning. It felt like a final, cold accounting of a life that had gone bankrupt. I used my half of the money to move into a small, one-bedroom apartment in a quiet part of Phoenix. It has a balcony where I keep a few potted plants and a small workbench for my wood carvings. There are no empty rooms, no memories of 47 years of marriage to trip over, and no documents waiting for a signature I don't understand. Claire called once, months after the papers were finalized. She didn't apologize for trying to warehouse me or for the money she took. She only wanted to tell me that the kids missed their old house and that things were tight now that they had to pay for tuition themselves. I listened to her voice, the voice of the daughter I had given everything to, and I realized I didn't feel anger anymore. I just felt a profound, hollow distance. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Claire," I said, and then I hung up. I am 74 years old now. I spend my mornings at the library and my afternoons working with my hands, building things that don't require a foundation of trust. Sometimes I see men my age sitting on park benches, and I wonder if they are guests in their own homes too. I learned the hard way that the strongest structures can be dismantled by the people you let inside the gates. Last Sunday, I sat at my small kitchen table and ate a piece of cake I bought for myself. There were no melting candles and no one glancing at an empty driveway. It was quiet, it was honest, and it was mine. I don't have a family that needs me, but for the first time in a long time, I am a man who finally belongs to himself. The desert sun still sets in a violent, beautiful orange every evening, but I no longer fear the dark. I am Arthur Penhaligon, and I am still standing. If this story meant something to you, subscribe. There's more to come.